I thought I would read a few articles that I wrote on the topic of justice several years ago, around 2017, since the situation's arisen where former President Trump is on trial for, I don't know, what is there a total of perhaps 100 felony charges against him in various places from Georgia to New York, mostly brought by Democrats and Democrat lawyers who have taken to try to develop a one-party system by disqualifying the opposition political candidate. Plainly, the Republicans needed to run a lawyer themselves in order to deal with the idea that one can use the law to rule virtually a one-party system sort of approach to things and develop that. They needed a lawyer to run counter to that. Well, anyway, I will read these few articles on the topic of justice. Retributive punishment in the evolution of history, 31 July 2017. Retributive justice is condign punishment for crimes. Every era has some sort of governing theory of punishment, or several, that are applied. If people use their honest best theory in the era, it may be difficult to find fault with it. If obvious injustice is punishment or correction occurs such that people know it is wrong, then it is wrong. Plainly, a continuing quest for improvement and corrections in response to criminal activity is in the best interest of society, more of a utilitarian concern, though. Secular laws, according to various theories of retributive or utilitarian punishment, were formed to control nonconformists to legal parameters of social behavior. Some regard them as heartless, and so retributive forms are morphed by reformers increasingly into empirical social contracts for progenitors of acceptable sin, training for convicts to train them to support secular political powers. That is, they haven't been designed by those with the laws of God written upon their hearts and minds. They have hearts of stone instead of flesh, and minds that are not born of the Spirit. I suppose a more modern synthetic approach to corrections for crimes than retribution. Simple retributive justice may be ineffective except in time of war, civil disorder, when summary execution may be required for survival. There are too many people shot out of the canon of life that are incapable of understanding why they are in jail instead of at Harvard. Correction can inform them why, whereas retribution probably won't. The roles of punishment are to prevent, deter, correct, and or cause suffering to perpetrators of crimes. Durkheim, besides writing the first study of suicide, regarded crime as having some positive value, largely that it supported social change. Yet not all social change is good, some is bad. If, for example, there were cannibals in Wisconsin that wanted to eat their neighbors, which would not be a positive social change for the good, though it would be criminal. Criminal activity, rather than reason and social advice and consent to change laws, serves revolutionary ends regarding the established governing powers. It is consistent with fascist methods to get what is wanted. When some people are unjust or appear so to large numbers of people, that inflauds the nature of social power and control by the ruling sovereign power. Not all people were in agreement with those within ruling power in virtually every nation in the history of man. In democracy, people theoretically try to improve justice and the efficiency of government so that it may function well yet not impinge the personal rights of individuals. Different forms of government may have different theories of punishment, such as execution for anti-state activity. Retributive theories of punishment originate with payment in kind for criminal offenses, lex talionis. Because it is impossible to have perfect justice with perfect witness, flawless evaluation of the motive for the offense, with mind-reading of perps and victims, there are implicit dangers in the principle of eye for an eye retribution. The video on lex talionis related that it actually provided a measured response to crime that was fair and balanced, more or less, rather than excessive. One can imagine sentencing someone to a lifetime of torture for some minor offense in youth as an example of disproportionate retributive justice. Yet there were moderate positions in disproportionate punishment to that cognizant of kinship relationship and the need to quell violence. One may read Tacitus's Germania for examples of Eurojustice in the 1st century A.D. Quote from Germania: "Punishments, administration of justice. In their counsels, an accusation may be preferred or a capital crime prosecuted. Penalties are distinguished according to the offense. Traitors and deserters are hanged on trees. The coward, the unwarlike, the man stained with abominable vices is plunged into the mire of the morass with a hurdle put over him." This distinction in punishment means that crime, they think, ought in being, unquote, in being punished to be exposed, while infamy ought to be buried out of sight. Lighter offenses, too, have penalties proportioned to them. He who is convicted and fined is fined in a certain number of horses or of cattle. Half of the fine is paid to the king or to the state, half to the person whose wrongs are avenged, and to his relatives. In these same councils they also elect the chief magistrates who administer law in the cantons and the towns. Each of these has 100 associates chosen from the people who support him with their advice and influence, unquote. Now, that was the real unquote, not that prior one. At any rate, it is worth noting that much of Western common law came not from the ancient Middle East or Greece, but from Germania and Britain and their traditions of common law, such as the Salic law of King Clovis in the 6th century. Primogeniture shaped many levels of European society until the late Middle Ages and beyond. Quote concerning wounds from the Salic law. Title 17 concerning wounds. 1. If anyone have wished to kill another person, and the blow have missed, he on whom it was proved shall be sentenced to 2,500 dinars, which make 63 shillings. 2. If any person have wished to strike another with a poisoned arrow, and the arrow have glanced aside, and it shall be proved on him, he shall be sentenced to 2,500 dinars, which make 63 shillings. 3. If any person strike another on the head so that the brain appears, and the 3 bones which lie above the brain shall project, he shall be sentenced to 1,200 dinars, which make 30 shillings. 4. But if it shall have been between the ribs, or in the stomach, so that the wound appears and reaches to the entrails, he shall be sentenced to 1,200 dinars, which make 30 shillings, besides 5 shillings for the physician's pay. 5. If anyone shall have struck a man so that blood falls to the floor, and it be proved on him, he shall be sentenced to 600 dinars, which make 15 shillings. 6. But if a freeman strike a freeman with his fist, so that blood does not flow, he shall be sentenced for each blow up to 3 blows to 120 dinars, which make 3 shillings. Title 18. Concerning him who before the king accuses an innocent man. If anyone before the king accuse an innocent man who is absent, he shall be sentenced to 2,500 dinars, which make 63 shillings. Unquote. Plainly, Clovis and people of his day regarded monetary punishment significantly. In light of later material in the course concerning for-profit prisons, that money element is important, since there were probably many that could not pay. One need to do historical research to determine what happened to those without money that were convicted. Plainly, the advantage for satisfying legal penalties for those convicted was with the aristocracy and nobles of means, rather than with those without. I wanted to write something, if they were even subject to the law. I wanted to write something about Dr. Knight's video and comments about Genesis and Adam and Eve. There are numerous ways of shaping retributive justice and for thinking about the people deserving punishment or not, and if the punishment was or should be proportionate. Obviously, when one does not comprehend what occurred, it is difficult to form a kind of post hoc determination of a punishment being just, fair, or whatever with an accuracy. Dr. Knight's account of the fall from the garden as a tiny peccadillo and just eating a fruit plainly was an interpretation of a man without faith in God. He regarded it as a small crime and the killing of Cain by Abel as a large one. Adam and Eve in the garden is one of the most interesting stories of the Bible. They incurred correction for the original sin of eating of the tree of knowledge. For those of actual faith in God, there was a real fall from grace. The correction was addition of all the characteristics of becoming a biological being in a thermodynamic system with all of the drives inherent across the animal kingdom. Adam and Eve showed that they could not follow the will of God, as he said to do directly. God was concerned that eating of the tree of knowledge had made the disobedient pair as little gods. He constrained their existence to the temporal universe, therefore, before they could also eat of the tree of eternal life and become real problems. That criterion is quite different than the secular and even atheist paradigm that Dr. Knight put forward. Dr. Knight also did not believe in the divine origin of the Decalogue. He did not regard it as being delivered unto Moses, who prophesied essentially that a man of whom King David fit the role would dwell upon the writings day and night. Moses probably invented Hebrew writing and commissioned the writing of works that became the Pentateuch when assembled in the court of Solomon or Rehoboam formally and redacted later. For-profit prisons, corrupt or not. July 27, 2017. Fundamentally, arresting the innocent or violating constitutional rights of individuals for the economic advantage of the corrupt seems to be the largest problem, yet I disagree with that privately operated prisons are inherently evil, though I am no expert. If the judiciary were privately run, then there would be an enormous problem that ends democracy, I would think. Yet private contractors responding to government contracts create efficiency, and the contracts need not be extended if their performance is poor. Maybe the largest problem is that the government writes poor contracts that don't reward private prisons for performance or take away money for high recidivism rates. Prisons that produce excellent graduates should be rewarded. The private sector is supposed to produce better products or services through competition and the profit motive. If government officials writing contracts are stupid or corrupt, they wouldn't even know what sort of results to reward or penalize. Governments like to expand in size too. Government jobs are fundamentally the best paying and safest bet for ordinary people to work for, with good retirement and health benefits, good pay, and easy hours. Building more public prisons staffed by union workers is very expensive and difficult to change or close too, probably more difficult to shut down than a private prison. The corruption of the Old South, before the end of peonage, involuntary servitude, sharecropping, work gangs, and Reconstruction era neo-slavery in for-profit subjugation, was a terrible offense against democracy. Plainly, history shows that different cultures merging can be brutal and slow to change. Before modern technology, it was challenging even to communicate well from city to city for many people. That social isolation allowed the corrupt to flourish and corrupt organizations to prosper, including government. Nearly all human social organizations seek to increase in size and power. People occupy roles in organizations with inertial drive seeking to be materially rewarding and secure. Free enterprise, given some liberty to experiment with the means and methods to deliver select reform criteria stipulated in contracts, may produce better results than government thinkers that have largely failed to generate satisfactory results so far. Many have noted that drug dealers, often called low-level, go to jail a lot. No one has commented that illegal mind-altering drugs cause brain damage in people, and that altered brains and thought can drive people to commit crimes, even if they are not drug sales crimes. Stopping the epidemic of brain damage, opioid use causes brain damage, and even marijuana is believed to damage white matter, the corpus callosum, connecting the halves of the brain together. This is a little bit different. This essay, it's Science Wrong About the Bible Again on Canaanites. And I would comment before I read this that so much of the media and sensationalist headlines are supported by lightly researched facts, knowing that most people that read it won't do the research themselves and haven't the educational background to even understand where things can be just implications and lightly supported and even wrong and wrong impressions. Yet they do make the money on publishing the headlines, and of course there's no correction later. It's getting the number of views for your article is what is important. Science Wrong About the Bible Again. A science article claims the Bible, this is from 27 July 2017. A science article claims the Bible says the Canaanites were wiped out, and scientists have examined DNA from the era showing that millions of people exist descended from Canaanites. They want to prove the Bible wrong, an unscientific motive, often creating glee in the godless atheist left branch of scientists, perhaps a majority. Scientists often interpret Scripture in a way that suits them in order to refute it. In other words, they create a straw man fallacy and beat that. In Deuteronomy 7, God commands the chosen people to wipe out the sinful nations, 7 of them, already occupying the land that today is known as Israel. It was made plain that the Jews weren't supposed to fraternize or merge with the Canaanites even a little bit, hence the harsh language. Reason in Scripture would indicate there would be lots of survivors. The Jews just couldn't perfectly fulfill divine commands in the case as elsewhere. Incidentally, the 7 Canaanite cities represent 7 sins. Canaanite is said to mean merchants. I suppose one could compare them to Wall Street. I will post the passage about the order. Deuteronomy 7, King James Version. 7. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hast cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites and the Girgashites, the Amorites and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. 2. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them. 3. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. 4. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. 5. But thus shall ye deal with them. Ye shall destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire. 6. For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. 7. The Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you, because ye were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. 8. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondsmen from the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. 9. Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. 10. And repayeth them that hate him to their face to destroy them. He will not be slack to them that hateth him. He will repay him to his face. 11. Thou shalt therefore keep the commandments, and the statutes, and the judgments, which I command thee this day to do them. 12. Wherefore it shall come to pass, if ye hearken to these judgments, and keep them and do them, that the Lord thy God shall keep unto thee the covenant and the mercy which he sware unto thy fathers. 13. And he will love thee, and bless thee, and multiply thee. He will also bless the fruit of thy womb, and the fruit of thy land, the corn, thy wine, and thine oil, the increase of thine kine, and the flocks of thy sheep, in the land which he sware unto thy fathers to give thee." Unquote. It's lucky that scientists don't actually read the Bible, or know that in Isaiah 17:9 it says that the Moabites were driven away, leaving because of desolation. Moab was another problem nation adjacent to the lost Canaanite nations, 7 nations wiped out. Even if Israel had defeated and destroyed as many Canaanites as they could during the conquest, there would still have been numerous rural Canaanite survivors that would have decided moving away was a good idea. I feel sure that God knew the Jews could not accomplish genocide, not even having tracking drones to blast escaping fugitives or satellites to observe them. Some scientists should use a little reason when addressing the Bible and at least have a fair idea what's in it, even if not what it means, and try using a Google search before publishing in prestigious scientific journals. Isaiah 17:9, 11, King James Version. 9. In that day shall his strong cities be as a forsaken bough, and an uppermost branch, which they left because of the children of Israel, and there shall be desolation. 10. Because thou hast forgotten the God of thy salvation, and hast not been mindful of the rock of thy strength. Therefore shalt thou plant pleasant plants, and shalt set it with strange slips. 11. In the day shalt thou make thy plant to grow, and in the morning shalt thou make thy seed to flourish. But the harvest shall be a heap in the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. Another article. That chapter of U.S. history most don't know. 27 July 2017. Usually I don't watch TV, so I missed one interesting PBS documentary on a form of slavery that continued after the Civil War in the South. What happened was prisons for profit were invented, and freed slaves having a hard time getting a job were often snared for vagrancy or other petty offenses and given crazy sentences on the chain gang for a sheriff or leased to mining and other corporations. That was a big business and continued until 1923, a little too recently. Humanity has always discovered ways to procure cheap or free labor. Illegal aliens are the big item now for exploiters looking to pay below minimum legal wage. The mortality rate of the neo-slaved blacks, it was usually black labor, was nearly 50%. As someone pointed out, slave owners cared about their investments staying alive, while leased slaves provided by for-profit legal procurers, like sheriffs, might have been regarded as nearly disposable since leased workers could be replaced for free. 25 July 2017, the Brideswell prisons. In 1655, the first house of correction, named the Bridewell, was built in London to put idlers, vagabonds, and sundry poor people thought to be up to no good to forced work and incarceration. Numerous such facilities were built around England. According to one article, the distinction between those poorhouses and prisons was abolished in 1865. Karl Marx, a fair social observer, commented in Das Kapital that a vast number of rural people were kicked off rural holdings to be forced into the city to work in factories of the Industrial Revolution. That would have increased problems of urban life, social strife, and poverty. In the United States, in New York, a very famous Bridewell prison was built by the British to incarcerate American prisoners of war with extreme and harsh conditions. The provost marshal of British prisoners admitted starving 2,000 patriots to death and executing 275 outright for being obnoxious persons. The Brits reopened the prison during the War of 1812 when they occupied New York City. Aaron Burr fled to avoid being incarcerated in the Bridewell. 25 July 2017, sketching the ancient history of prisons. Prisons were not too rare in ancient times, yet to the extent they were, it was because only select classes could be imprisoned. As democracy spread, the franchise of imprisonment increased too, replacing former forced labor, serfdom, slavery, and death as punishment for the masses from above. A modern understanding of what prisons are may distort the view of history, though. One recalls the Apostle Paul's time in prison as well as John the Baptist. Prisons occupy a niche, however, for political systems that must treat a select class of subjects or citizens with some human rights and not just send them into slavery or the slave galley, salt mine, until death or wherever the authorities sent them. The Romans developed prisons, and a famous one was the Mamertine prison, created by Ancus Marius in 640 AD, and was located in a sewer and dungeons beneath Rome. In the Middle Ages, numerous prisons existed where hostages and subjects were kept by the ruling class for various reasons. Famous prisons in England included the dungeons of Pontefract Castle, mentioned by Shakespeare in Richard III, and Carnarvon Castle's dungeons established in the 13th century. Switzerland had the notorious Chillon Castle dungeon, and of course, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Bastille prison that had been converted from a fort. Some local gaols or jails kept prisoners for a very long time. The author John Bunyan was kept in the local Bedford town gaol for a dozen years for preaching without a license. Butyrka prison in Moscow is referenced as existing in the 1600s and probably was used to incarcerate individuals from social classes that could not be sent to forced labor camps or converted into serfs. Chateau d'If in France held religious and political prisoners from 1634 to approximately 1899. One shouldn't overlook the Tower of London or lesser-known places of captivity such as Warwick Castle. The inefficient state of incarceration in America, 24 July 2017. Incarcerations for criminal offenses are an existing yet standard procedure for addressing the problem of crime. Arrest and detention or incarceration is an historically common way to sequester those who are deemed to be enemies of civil order. Incarceration is debatably an improvement over the way legal justice systems worked in ancient times. Incarceration is equivalent to time in the ice hockey penalty box instead of having one's hands cut off for theft, as in Sharia law in some Muslim nations. Many government inefficiencies are not changed until something compels it to. The U.S. government spends $13 billion apiece on Ford-class aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers were invented by the Japanese, who launched the first one in 1922, instead of inventing a more modern way to launch fighter aircraft from the ocean or wherever. Global warming concerns are pressurizing government to move away a little from producing greenhouse gassing in automobiles that burn gasoline, yet not fast enough. Few have any real interest in upgrading correction systems. For-profit prisons are like for-profit Obamacare health care for the poor. Expand instead of innovate and invent. It is easier to criticize it than to realistically fix it, and this is still the age of neo-romanticism, subjectivism, and moral relativism. Government, people are left alone to be concerned about new tax cuts for the 1% they would like to make. The ancient Germanic Frankic-Salic law of King Clovis is an example of change in the West from the way it is now. Title 17 concerning wounds. Oh, well, I have read this, I believe, already. Three modern problems with incarceration are: one, it costs too much. $30,000 to $40,000 annually per person. 2. Incarceration, as it is presently, isn't efficient at correcting, with a 70% recidivism rate. 3. Incarceration sends criminals to training academy for career criminals. The remedy for all three problems is in technology. Inmates should be physically isolated from other criminals, not concentrated, and subject to a rigorous body and mind training course, using all the efficiencies of technology available today for instruction. Being in prison should be like being in the Marine Corps regarding discipline, yet with inmates force-fed academic intelligence and isolation. There, only social contracts should be with staff, counselors, and those without felony convictions, including instructors. One should be able to design individual training courses for individual inmates that would get corrections done in a third of the time of sentence as it is, saving quite a bit of money annually. If recidivism occurred, a different approach might be warranted from the old playbook from the Middle Ages to make prison less desirable, such as wind cages, yet not until death or major organ failure. Mass incarceration, too. Reasons for racial percent differences. 24 July 2017. Culture and historical differences may be largely responsible for the variegated incarceration rate regarding race. White culture was a more or less secure majority culture with established roles. Except for the effect of increased national drug use, the percent of white people incarcerated should have stabilized and continued to decrease decades ago. It should not have increased because the percent of non-whites of the U.S. population has increased, unless one thinks that increasing non-whites should catalyze increased white crimes. Hispanics were an external proletariat illegally in the United States, in millions of cases entering the U.S.A. to form an internal proletariat. The cultural differences of non-established, less sedentary, and poorer populations in criminal behavior compared to sedentary established populations is notable. One might wonder, too, why Mexico has a lower incarceration rate and a far higher murder rate, and if that may mean that the U.S.A. can afford to process more people through the criminal correction systems than Mexico, whereas direct eye for an eye, extrajudicial justice may be somewhat more frequent in Mexico. Black Americans had the social integration problems following the end of the Jim Crow era. Then problems developed for all American men during the same period when the old-style industrial economy was outsourced overseas. High unemployment rates made a generation of black youth half-employed or underemployed, while illegal alien workers watered down the value of wage labor in the United States. Real wages adjusted for inflation have not changed for white men since the early 1970s, while affirmative action has changed the employment and social landscape in the U.S.A. for non-white. There were far fewer good-paying industrial or men's jobs as time rolled by for men of any race in the U.S.A., with a couple generations of white male babies aborted, while far fewer black or Hispanic babies were aborted. There were social structure and composition differences between populations of the three races as well. Smaller families can invest more in education generally. An unstable population tends to settle down, while the opposite case exists with immigrants regarding crime. Immigrants can bring bad as well as good to receiving nations. The modern influences of Islam, atheism, and the decrease of Christian values, in addition to financial sophistry and the overconcentration of wealth, as well as global stress in the ecosphere, have changed the way people think of people. The value of human life may be transitioning to commoditization. Politicians cannot think much beyond Wall Street and class electoral issues, much less comprehend corrections reform. In fact, to ad-lib here somewhat, the Democrat Party may have just three issues that matter. Women vote for abortion, Hispanics vote for more Hispanics, and homosexuals vote for homosexual interests. And issues like the economy and the environment take definite back roles, lower-ranking issues. And that makes for a dumb electorate. And it's quite possible that the American electorate is, in society generally, is quite overrated. It may be, intellect is overrated. It may not be that smart. It may be fairly unintelligent, actually. But the technology and the mass culture that's been developed by mass media have made Americans mass consumers, but mass employees of big corporations, which are owned by a tiny minority of concentrated wealth people. Families are an endangered item, especially in a nation with legal homosexual marriage. One would wish that healthy nuclear families in a good community were the norm, yet that probably wouldn't be achieved by letting violent criminals and dope sellers live on the corner. Some of the children may be better off with the gangster away from home, ironically. With a better correction system, it might be possible to restore criminals to their families who may have already divorced. More than 50% of marriages end in divorce. If the criminal is away from home, he is also away from his victims in his own family or down the block. That can be some comfort to the victims. Children should have better education in the United States. An equivalent of Coursera for kids might be useful. Even Google Translator can translate words spoken into any foreign language. In my opinion, voting rights should be restored 7 years after sentence is served. If there are no more felony convictions, one should not lose voting rights forever for a felony conviction, yet the right to vote should fairly be suspended for 7 years, as drunk driving can revoke driving rights for some time after sentence is served, for example. If people cannot obey the laws, the state has no interest in letting such individuals vote. 1 in 10 black males are in jail. Consequences. Maybe a reduction in crime happens when violent criminals are drug sellers and taken off the streets. Yet also great cost to the states is the price for keeping one guy in jail. Costs $30,000 to $40,000 annually, and what, $56 billion per annum in total, plus inflation. Must be much higher over the last 6 years. Perhaps it's $100 billion now. Obviously, there should be a far better correction system that presently exists that is less time-consuming and that has less than a 10% recidivism rate. Who would allow any sort of system with 70% recidivism to go, be funded as if it wasn't dysfunctional? Half of the federal prisons are in for drug offenses. Those guys not only poison the people and corrupt society, spreading rotten incompetence, even brain damage to their victims, they unfairly make a profit that mocks those honest and poor free enterprise tradesmen already being bumped out by illegal aliens. Presumably, half of the black males in jail are there for violent crimes. People that perp violent crimes are often repeat offenders. The last 40 years is more or less the period of desegregation and affirmative action, increased and pervasive dope use and decline of quality math scores, trouble and social change in River City. One could let them all out to become Catholic priests and nuns, of course, yet they might not. 20 million illegal aliens helped increase Hispanic crimes in the U.S.A. Cell phone and computers helped gangs organize crime across the board and in cities from Chicago to Mexico City. The Clinton and Obama administrations had a spike in criminal activities. The widespread use of illegal drugs caused a lot of crime, and minorities were traffickers and victims of that at the same time. Drug sales in a society that underemployed black youth, black males, probably drove many or influenced many black males to sell drugs in order to earn a living. The degradation of social values due to moral relativism changed the way people think and behave. Then a great deal of post-Vietnam and post-Jim Crow skepticism created a vast counterculture that was disruptive of traditions and stability domestically for reasons good and bad. That may have influenced black culture more as well. The atheism and disintegration of nuclear families created more social enemy and chaos. And that drove them also into mass culture, like hip-hop culture. And mass culture, encouraged by the broadcast media, has taken almost a communist approach to socialization, where class social rights matter far more than individual rights. The lack of moral leadership, Al Gore, quote, in the absence of presiding moral authority, unquote, encouraged certain kinds of crime and gang activity. The Mexican drug wars had some spillover into the U.S.A., as the U.S.A. is the primary buyer of dope for decadent Democrats. The post-Cold War era of globalism made those that enjoy free e-dollars from the Federal Reserve more inclined to just lock up and forget the incarcerated rather than correct them. Congress can't even get Obamacare to reach the very poor and homeless interstate class of Americans because the federal programs are designed by comfortable bureaucrats rather than people understanding the reality of poverty at the very low end, such as traveling seasonally to be in warmer places and to avoid the hotter places. Law enforcement and evidence gathering has more camera videos of criminals that jurors are unsympathetic with, hence long sentences and are tough and get released, especially if they proclaimed innocence. I think people discriminate as much or more against those labeled with a mental diagnosis. If one pleads mea culpa as a mental, one may be employed, yet then tracked and predestined to be treated as a mental psych nigger the remainder of one's life. Those unfortunate enough to be felons and mental would be received by society as the criminally insane, a tough label to live with. On mass incarceration, Post 1, 24 July 2017. First of all, I think there is no social contract among citizens in the U.S.A. That's a more French Rousseauian notion that resembles communism to a certain extent. The U.S.A. has a constitution and laws that one should obey, or as a free citizen, they may choose not to, and then should expect correction rather than punishment for violating those laws. I wanted to make a note here, too, to say something about something else that victimizes poor people, and that's the 1040 form, the IRS. They make it so difficult for poor retired people who have very small Social Security income to find what the standard deduction is. I believe instead of $13,500 this year, it's something more like you get an extra $2,000, so it's $15,500. They'll go from Schedule A to Schedule R to Schedule 1 and 2 and 3, or A, B, and C, and they'll refer to a Line 6, but they'll put the Line 6 may exist in 3 separate different documents, and so it's just confusing trying to find these simple basic facts that, and the one really basic question is Social Security income taxable? And, to find the answer to that is really tough. And old people over 65 are more inclined to heart attacks anyway, so if the IRS makes 1040 forms, or Congress, whoever designs the things, more for the benefit of the middle class and all these Americans that have a lot of IRAs and investments in Wall Street and interest accounts and things, and can actually afford accounts to do it, or software that they can just drop the data into, and they crank out a properly filled out 1040 form. That they're going to cause problems for poor old people. It shouldn't be that difficult to find those two simple things, at least, for people over 65 who don't have a lot of extra income. Is the Social Security income taxable, and what is the standard deduction? One shouldn't have to go to a couple of different schedules in order to find out what the standard deduction is. That's absurd for retired people. While they do put it on for people who aren't 65, they put that on the form. Okay, to resume. Mass incarceration is simply a concatenation of all of the individuals that have broken laws and should be undergoing correction rather than punishment. Those that cannot obey the laws of the United States, such as illegal entry, ought to expect correction, and swiftly. Justice is really a matter of accurate determination of the guilt or innocence of an individual in breaking a particular law. Injustice, obviously, would be to convict someone innocent, and vice versa. Justice is not about politics and quantification of race or gender regarding those convicted, so long as the laws are just. If it were not so, women could be regarded as unfairly advantaged, since they have such a low incarceration number in comparison to men. If the correction system has failed and cost society a tremendous amount of money and needless human suffering, and I think it has, then it should be changed. Putting criminals into a concentration facility together plainly is a silly way to go about training people not to be criminals. It is more of a filing and security approach for disposing of inconvenient items that are people. In a godless atheist society that scoffs at Christian values, and with the black prison population having a large number of Muslims, it is likely that the religious criterion should be restrained and applied only moderately. Christianity itself is under attack and slowly being taken over by secular values. If mercy for the incarcerated means to not provide correction, that is consistent with a corrupt society. What about racial disparities in incarceration rates? Maybe the evidence gathering technology progress allows more accurate determination of guilt or innocence. It is possible that with the extreme mobility of people in America today, incarceration is regarded as a way to assure that perpetrators don't just travel somewhere else to find new opportunities for crime. With more female judges, they may want to send more males to jail. Statistics would determine if that speculation has validity. Maybe a disposable, consumer-oriented society wants to dispose of criminals quickly and take them out of circulation, as one might remove counterfeit currency. Of course, the Federal Reserve issues a lot of free money to big banks, and some regard that as a moral equivalent of counterfeiting for the benefit of the 1%, so that line of speculation may be inaccurate. Some might think that whites have lower crime rates because they are more established and sedentary than immigrants from Latin America, many of whom are illegal aliens or first-generation native-born with dual citizenship. Also, white women aborted a couple generations of healthy white male boys and girls, so the white population is older and less wild than Hispanics, whom have more new culture socialization issues and fewer abortions. Whites just don't have the gangs that they used to many decades ago, while Hispanics have a rich gang culture and blacks invented modern gangster rap culture. I don't know about the socialization relationship of that to criminal behavior, yet it isn't a bar mitzvah sort of approach to things, and plainly it is a mass culture that is not intellectual, and neither is college sports, which should offer scholarships to scholars for scholarship. If there are racial disparities in incarceration rates, one might wonder why. One might ask if the temporal rate of incarceration should be the same among any races normally, when the cultural origins of the races differ historically. Should an established race in a given society that comprises a majority historically that has worked through its social structure evolution reasonably well have a higher or lower incarceration or social disconformity rate than an emergent race emerging into cultural prosperity that was previously not established in the majority culture? One might wonder about abstract relationships for historical and cultural evolution and the phenomenon of mass incarceration without considering the geographic and population density factors. Since Roe v. Wade, white women have aborted 2 or 3 generations, tens of millions of young white males and females whom might have committed more crimes, while Hispanic, especially immigrants and blacks, have had far fewer abortions. New white female judges may not be so reluctant to sentence males of any race before the bench to prison. I should comment, too, that in addition to committing aborting potential criminals, they also aborted geniuses. There are 3 or 4 true geniuses per million people, so they may have aborted 70 or 80 or 100 geniuses, Einstein-level geniuses. One might wonder if in a different social configuration, if women might not have equal incarceration rates as males, such that there was no disparity. If the U.S. Supreme Court has 3 justices that are female, while incarcerated females are 123 per 100,000 and males 1,352 per 100,000, can that be regarded as efficient judicial gender representation? Incarceration rates may more or less parallel high school graduation rates as well as actual learning. I don't know. Culture matters, and a less intellectual culture in an era where good non-college educated jobs not designed for more passive sedentary female workers are in decline creates a possibility of more idle and unemployed time for young males who are restive and may perpetrate crimes. Dope use also affects people in inner cities, and they may have more readily committed crimes because of the high population density that they could avoid if they were living in a less populous society and could be degenerate without troubling anyone. Blacks in the post-Jim Crow era had more challenges for evolving into new and independent economic ventures for a variety of reasons, while immigrant Hispanics also shared the characteristic I am considering here, the lack of social stability. In the Vietnam conflict, there was a great difference in the performance and unit cohesiveness to discipline under stress among various units during different periods of the conflict. The mostly volunteer army that existed during the early 1960s had entered service during the Eisenhower era of the 1950s and were highly disciplined and performed well. It was something more like conventional war. The later conscript army that followed their discharge had, and they didn't re-enlist, had more discipline and performance problems, the worst being the Americal Division formed just for the war and disassembled thereafter. It had no unit military history and had great discipline problems, including the My Lai massacre of Lieutenant Calley's unit. Units with military tradition have more discipline. New units, especially guerrilla units and new militias like those of Serbia in the Serbian War and ISIS, tend toward war crimes.